Hey class, today I want to, or at least in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about Martin Heidegger and the idea that is going to be sort of central for the first couple weeks of this class of the question before the question and where that comes from and how that fits into both Heidegger's philosophy and what it is we're going to be doing in our class for the semester. So, a little bit background about Heidegger. Heidegger is one of the more famous or infamous philosophers in the 20th century. He is unavoidable in terms of his influence and disastrous in some of his choices. And I don't want to get into the details of, what's called the Heidegger controversy, and especially out of the recent publications of his Schwarzarheft, which are his black notebooks, which are basically sort of a philosophical diary that he kept in the 30s and 40s that show him to be essentially a repulsive character. But we didn't really need to have those notebooks published to know that Heidegger was a pretty awful human being. There was enough anecdotal reports about his interactions with people for us to know that. But he remains one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. And fortunately, his most influential work was written about 10 years before he started making really stupid decisions. So you could perhaps wonder, argue, hope that this precedes that. And this is something that Dr. T and I have sort of talked about for years, trying to figure out how Heidegger could be both so smart and so stupid at the same time. But in any case, the book that made Heidegger famous is the book that I have in my hand here, Sein und Zeit. And this is, Being and Time. And this is the book that put Heidegger on the map as a philosopher. And we're reading a small selection from it, from the introduction to Being and Time, where he's trying to explain what it is that he's trying to do in this book and in his philosophical project in general. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to talk about how that relates to what we're going to be doing and how it's somewhat different. Heidegger's overall philosophical project is to sort of reawaken what he calls the question of being. He thinks that philosophy, since Plato and Aristotle thousands of years before, has not really asked the question of being. And you might be reasonably enough wondering, what is the question of being? Well, for Heidegger, the question of being would be phrased as, was ist sein? And that's makes a lot more sense in German than it does in English. So, was ist sein is literally what is being. In English, that would literally be what is to be, because sein is just the unconjugated or the infinitive form of to be in German. So Heidegger wants to know basically about isness, you could say. What does it mean for something to just be? But I shouldn't limit it to just something, as if you read a lot of Heidegger, you'll know why. But so, just what is being? What is existence? And the way Heidegger tries to get at what is something or what is existence is through an analysis of human existence. So, if you like, this is why Heidegger is one of the founding figures of modern existentialism, because his analysis of being, this sort of very abstract metaphysical question that he wants to deal with, he says, begins with an analysis of the human being in our everydayness, in our day-to-day life. Now, there's a lot of interesting analyses that Heidegger has in Being and Time when he is analyzing everydayness. There's, interesting discussions of death, of crowds, of discourse, and interesting part about turn signals on cars. He's got a lot of interesting things. And one of the exciting things about Heidegger when he first published this book in the 1920s, was he was one of the first philosophers to talk about these things, to talk about movies. He doesn't talk about specific movies, but he just talks about the fact of movies and radio and sort of the effect of mass media on our everydayness, which was something that was beginning to percolate up in the 1920s. Right? He's one of the first people to do that, to almost, in a sense, give philosophers permission to do that by doing it so well. But what we're going to focus on is a chapter in the introduction where he called about the formal structure of the question of being. And what I'm interested here is his analysis not of the question of being, but of all questions as such. And he makes this point in the second paragraph in the reading, that yes, my main concern is with the question of being, but before I can dig into that, I need to say some things about sort of the formal structure of questioning as such. And what Heidegger wants to show his readers is that asking a question like, what is X, is actually a much more complicated phenomena than we might typically think, and that questioning is not sort of innocent or naive. Right? We sometimes like to say, like, well, I'm just asking, or, just asking a question. But what Heidegger is going to try to show is that whenever you're just asking a question, there's a lot that's behind the question. And so let's dig into this a little bit. So he says, every question is a seeking. Jedes Fragen ist ein Suchen. Jedes Suchen hat seine vorgängiges Geleit aus dem Gesuchen her. Right? So every question is a suchen, which is like a seeking, to look after something. And then he goes on to say that whenever you're seeking or looking after something, you have some idea of what it is you expect to find. Right? You have some idea in your head about what would count as an answer to that question. So Meno's paradox is that it is impossible to genuinely ask a question. And now Meno says this is because if you genuinely ask a question, he takes that to mean like you don't have an answer, you have no idea of an answer. So Meno says, if you have no idea of an answer, then you won't know when you've answered your question. Right? Imagine that you're asked to solve a math problem that is like super hard. It's just beyond your capabilities. It's like, I was reading the other day about a mathematician that just solved this strange problem involving four-dimensional knots and showing that this four-dimensional knot is different from other kinds of four-dimensional knots. So imagine you're reading this, you're asked to solve this problem. And if you're like me, you have no idea even what the problem is about, much less what the answer would be. Which means I would have no idea whether or not I even answered the problem, right? Could I just be like, the answer is 7? Who knows, right? I have no idea what would even constitute an answer. So Meno's point is, if you really have no idea what would constitute an answer, you can't possibly even begin to answer the question, because even if you had the right answer, you wouldn't know. On the other hand, if you did have an idea of what constituted the answer, then you're not really asking the question, right? You're just kind of going through the motions of asking the question, but you already have some idea of what the answer is, maybe not super precise and nailed down, but some vague and general understanding. So this is roughly like the Meno paradox. And Heidegger, in this part of Being in Time, is in a way trying to reconstruct Meno's paradox, but also to show a way out of it. Because Heidegger's point is to say that Meno is misunderstanding questioning. We never ask a question without having some idea of what an answer is going to look like. That's why every questioning is a suchen. Every questioning is a seeking. And when you're seeking for something, you have an idea of what it is you're seeking for. So every questioning is looking for an answer. and trying to sort of get to the answer, but you have some idea about what the answer is going to be. Right, so you'll notice in about the fourth or fifth sentence, Heidegger is going to say that every question has what's asked after, right? Das Fragen hat als Fragen nach sein Gefragtes, right? That the question always has sort of a presumed answer, that there is a kind of, deep down, there is a sense in which whenever we're asking for something, we have some idea of where it is or what it might be, right? If I can't find my keys, I have some idea of where my keys might be, right? If you think about when you're looking for your keys, there are certain places you just don't look because you already have in your head the possible places where your keys could be, and you've excluded other possibilities where you just think your keys could not possibly be, right? So when I look for my keys, I don't check the cat's litter box because I've sort of excluded at the outset the possibility that I could have left my keys in there, right? So that there's a range of possible things that I'm asking about the Gefragtes. Now, in the case of psychology and how that sort of functions for us in this class is, how does psychology limit the range of possible answers that it could expect by the way it frames questions and by the way it understands what it's doing and why it's doing it? That's going to limit the range of possible answers. And then as we sort of as we see how psychology constructs itself, we'll see sort of that process as certain ways of doing things and certain approaches to doing things are excluded, which therefore also means excluding certain kinds of answers. Now, if you want to dig into this idea that Heidegger is talking about, ultimately its roots go all the way back to Plato. In a text from Plato called the Meno, there's introduced a very important paradox called the Meno paradox. And Socrates is talking to Meno about whether or not virtue can be taught. And the topic of the conversation doesn't really matter for the paradox. Because at one point, the paradox comes up when Meno says to Socrates, how can you look for something if you don't know what it is? Because if you don't know what it is, you won't know when you found it, right? So that if you are looking for something, you have some idea about what it'll be like when you find it. So what Heidegger is trying to show is that whenever you ask a question, there are already assumptions built in about how that question will be answered. And as he goes on to say, there's even going to be things built in about not just sort of what the content of the answer will be, but how you will go about seeking that answer. So, and if you read forward in a couple pages, like Heidegger will make this point regarding being, right? When I say earlier, I sort of corrected myself when I said, what kind of thing is being, right? Heidegger would not like me phrasing the question that way because that's me suggesting that being is a thing as opposed to, say, an event or let's say I'm thinking of being as a noun rather than as a verb, right? So, or sometimes philosophers will say what is thought? And that's going to give you a different kind of answer than if you say, what is thinking, right? One is sort of priming the pump for a sort of a substantive answer, right? Some sort of like noun or collection of nouns that'll tell you what the answer is, while the other is priming the pump for a sort of a verbal answer, or maybe a participle or a gerund, right? That suggests something more of an activity or an event rather than a thing. And so Heidegger is going to dig into the structure of this questioning, and this is one of the most important paragraphs probably in the history of 20th century philosophy. Because what this paragraph introduces, right, and like I've been belaboring this point, right, the idea of the question before the question. And this is an idea that gets picked up in a lot of different ways by a lot of different thinkers. So some of the other people that we'll read, and there'll be other videos to talk about them, we'll have Michel Foucault, who takes that Heideggerian idea, and Foucault is a lot more Heideggerian than I think is obviously apparent. Like, he doesn't like to talk about Heidegger as much as he likes to talk about Nietzsche or his like historical researches and things. But at his basic approach, he's Heideggerian in the sense that Foucault, whatever questions a specific, social science or social theory is trying to ask, and then try to show what comes before that question and makes those questions possible, what he calls in his book the archaeology of knowledge, which we're not going to have to read because it's pretty laborious and intense and boring. But in the archaeology of knowledge, he calls like the historical a priori, right? Basically, what are the, and Foucault kind of, goes in a different direction with this than Heidegger does, but what sort of historical and social conditions obtained to make these questions formulatable and askable, right? So you could see how Foucault is picking up from Heidegger's idea of the question before the question, right? And digging into what comes before a question is asked and what guides the asking of a question. Now, something similar, we'll see with, other people that we'll read throughout the semester. Max Weber, who's one of the other people we're reading, and I'll make a separate video about him, is not a Heideggerian, right? He's actually a little older than Heidegger, but we're going to look at his essay on science as vocation to get an idea about what was at work in the conception of science and what science was thought to be in the time that psychology was sort of being born and trying to establish itself as a science. Max Weber was doing something similar as a sociologist. Like, sociology and psychology were both kind of in having their births at roughly the same time. And in this famous essay, Science as Vocation, we see Max Weber trying to explain what it is that he thinks he's doing as a scientist. And since sociology and psychology are both sort of like, social sciences, I thought that would be a good way of getting into the understanding of what science is that is going to be guiding the way psychology forms its questions as it tries to determine itself to be a science. And the other nice thing about Weber's essay is that not surprising since he's a sociologist, is that it begins with a fairly lengthy description of university life in Germany and the United States. And that might seem to be a trivial point, but psychology lives in the university. And the structure of the university and the way the university works is going to have a determinant impact on how psychology works, and the kinds of things that psychologists do and the kinds of things that psychologists don't do. Sort of like the disciplinary boundaries have to be let's say, articulated and then enforced, and the university structure is a big part of both. So and we'll come back to that at the end of the semester when we talk about APA. But let's take a break.